Hello, everybody. Pascal here from Neutrality Studies, and we need to talk about the biggest news of the last week, which is that we now have a meeting agreed between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, confirmed from all sides. It's going to happen on a Friday, August 15th, and it will happen in Alaska, not in a neutral third place, but actually on US territory. Some people say that there are concerns about also the security of Vladimir Putin, but I must say this is probably a straightforward affair because both of these superpowers want to meet, and it's really inconceivable that the United States could in any way, shape or form do anything to the leader of Russia while visiting. Also, since this is an official state visit, I mean, it's just absolutely unthinkable, and it would be the Third World War if anything happened to Vladimir Putin in the United States. So we can also expect that this will be in a town fairly close to the Russian border. I mean, we must remember, right? Alaska is right next to Russia, only a few 50 to 100 kilometers apart from Russia's far east. So it is a straightforward place to meet. It's a straightforward place to travel to for both of them. And since it's going to be far away from Europe and from anywhere where even the Ukrainians could just show up, or the Europeans could stir some trouble, it's also a pretty secure location. And the Donald Trump gave a talk the other day, a press conference, and he was saying that a land swap would be included in this deal. He didn't go into any details, but it seems that so far that this meeting between the two, the way that it was prepared, also with Witkoff going to Moscow, the 3 hours discussion with Vladimir Putin, and the unreported negotiations that happened, and we know by now that they took place between the US and Russia, must have yielded some form of preliminary agreement of how this is supposed to go forward, and there will be land swaps. Now, land swaps, what here is being proposed. Let's look at this at the moment. I mean, nothing is proposed. We know of nothing. We only know where the military realities at the moment are, and it seems that the military realities are seeping through. That the United States is no longer able to just ignore that Russia has made very significant advances and has consolidated a lot of territory in Ukraine, and that this is now a sheer reality. And the Europeans are still in the mood of just fantasizing, right, and just demanding that Russia just give all of this territory back and withdraw, including Crimea, and then pay compensation and apologize. And that's, the Europeans are still in the mindset that is the only way, including then war criminal trials, in which they would be willing to agree to some form of peace with Russia. But that is obviously utterly ridiculous. But the Europeans are the Europeans, and they are stuck in their own narrative. They're stuck in their own little world. But what we're seeing now is that the one military power, the one economic power and political power that actually matters, the United States, is understanding that the war as a war, the way it has been fought out, is ending, and it is the United States, it is NATO, it is the alliance, the collective West that is losing on the battlefield. And the choice for the United States now is whether it comes to some form of understanding in order to create what I think we could be calling a proxy peace, and I will expand on that later, but or whether it's going to be a defeat, an obvious defeat of the United States, a defeat of US power, or whether the US still somehow takes itself out of this. Now, again, the battlefield realities are the following. We have the Russians that control the entire region of Lugansk and parts of Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. And we know, of course, that Vladimir Putin and the Russians are saying that no, all of these 4 territories, they need to come to us. It is what what Alex Christoforou on the Duran and Alexander Mercury's what they call Istanbul Plus, so the agreement that apparently is still on the table from the side of Mr. Putin, that you get a neutralized Ukraine that is not a member of NATO. You get all 4 of these territories, and in return there will be some form of agreement that the rest of Ukraine can have will have an independent future. Some people in the West call it a rump Ukraine, but I really think this is a misnomer. It's just going to be Ukraine without these territories. Now, what kind of swap could this include? I mean, if the words of Mr. Trump are to be trusted, the only land that could be that Russia could swap to Ukraine without actually breaching its own so far determined red lines would be the slivers in Kharkiv and in Sumy region that they also occupied, and which Mr. Lavrov referred to as the future Russian buffer zone inside of Ukraine. I mean, Russia could accept to give these back to Ukraine and withdraw from these places in return for Ukraine giving up the rest of Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson that the Russians currently are not holding. There is a second option that would make military sense, and that option would be that the Russians would be willing to give up parts of Zaporizhia and Kherson, namely the parts beyond the Dnieper. One thing is quite important, I believe, which is that the Dnieper here is a very defensible position, and it's a kind of a natural border. So in theory, one could think about the Russians being willing to say, like, okay, we, even under our current constitution, currently consider this land beyond the Dnieper, but still within the oblast of Kherson and Zaporizhia, as parts of Russia, and in within a grand bargain, we are willing to give that up and even change the Russian constitution in order to change the administrative borders of these 2 oblasts, so as to be able to legally, under the Russian constitution, under Russian law, to give this up. I mean, I must emphasize, right? The question is what both parties claim, and of course the Ukrainians claim that all of these territories are theirs, including Crimea. The Russians are now claiming no, all of these territories, including Crimea, are ours. So when we talk about a swap, the way that we frame what the swap is quite important, right? And there is, of course, a very strong argument saying that if Vladimir Putin gives these territories up, that would be actually a partial defeat of Russia, because Russia already made it clear that those are its red lines, and it demands that the entire territory, right? The entire territory here is given to Russia. So if it settles for anything less than the entire territory, then there are several hardliners in Russia, and a lot of people who will criticize their president for then not continuing with the special military operation, because it is clear by now, if they just continue doing what they're doing, this war of attrition, breaking the front lines, which they've been breaking through front lines time and time again. This is not a static war anymore. The Russians are on the march. So if you just keep marching, you will naturally get there, and then you will have everything. That's going to be the argument from the hawkish side of the Russians, right? Now, for the Ukrainians, this is, of course, and for the Europeans, this is in a sense surely a non-starter, and they're actually saying so. Actually, in this article here, it also says that the Europeans are even trying to in their panic mode, try to talk to the Americans, and the US, the team Trump is doing something quite smart. They did that before. They are now sending J.D. Vance to Europe. So Vance, I don't know if he's still there or not, but he went to Europe yesterday, and he talked to the British, and he also talked to Ukrainians, and they did that before as well, when the first phone calls started with Vladimir Putin, and you could see how different the envoys from Trump were sent to Europe in order to talk to them and actually keep them busy. just keep them busy while the Trump team itself and the Russians are talking it out, and make sure that the Europeans feel as if though they still have a connection to Donald Trump and feel as if though they can somehow still influence the process, while in reality all J.D. Vance is doing is actually holding their hands, while the inevitable decisions will be made among the leaders of the superpowers. It's going to be a decision it's going to be a grand bargain between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, and the Europeans have nothing to say in that. And they are outraged. They are furious. And you read also that that Zelensky, of course, rejects any land swap idea floated by Trump. Obviously he does, and he says like, no peace agreement can be reached without Ukraine. We will not have it. The point is, this is a proxy war. This is the United States of America, and partially with and through NATO, implementing warfare against Russia. So the Europeans and the Ukrainians, of course, are still pretending that no, this is a war of aggression of the Russians against Ukraine, so it is up to Ukraine to decide what happens. But the matter of the fact and the reality is, it is a contest between Moscow and Washington at its very core. There's other layers of the conflict, no doubt, other layers to it, including the layer in the Donbass, no doubt about it. But the overarching important geostrategic level of this is Washington and Moscow, and now we are at the point where both of them are actually signaling that they also understand it in this way. Because let's keep in mind, for the last 6 months, the Trump team, the Trump administration, pretended that it is still a neutral bystander, right? It is the mediator between Ukraine and Moscow, and that mediator charade is now collapsing, right? And it's going away, and it has to go away, and it is good that it is going away, because the charade is not what is happening. What is actually the case is that you need a grand bargain, a grand strategic understanding between Washington and Moscow, in order then from top down to end this war, and also to ameliorate the situation, and of course, as the Russians keep saying, to work on the root causes. And the root causes are the absence of a security structure. The Russians have been saying time and again, and the last time very, very loudly in December 2021, when they sent these draft treaties to Washington and Brussels, we need a security arrangement. The security arrangement needs to include a neutral Ukraine. We need to be clear about this, and then we need to hammer out other details, intermediate range missile agreements, right? Stationing agreements, like control agreements, mechanisms, in order to have shared security, to make sure that the security of one partner doesn't go at the expense of the other one. And the Americans, the Europeans, NATO at that time, the Biden administration, they shut the door on that one immediately, and they said like, no, Russia, you sit down and you just take what you're given and shut up. And the Russians say like, no, okay, fine. Then in that case, we fight. And they fought for over 3 years. And even when the Trump administration came in, they went along with this charade of the neutral mediator, but they didn't give up their war effort. They said, look, this is going to go hand in hand. We do diplomacy, as we always said. We always said we are prepared to do diplomacy, but we're going to do the military operation at the same time, because that's the only language the Europeans and the Americans actually speak. And we are not going to fall again for these empty promises. So we're going to do both, dual track, military and diplomatic track at the same time. And they've been doing it, and they're now at the point where the Americans are forced. They're forced to talk, because the more military defeat on the battlefield is inevitable, and even the biggest supporters of Ukraine, like Julian Röpke and so on, a German war correspondent, they're seeing how the front lines are not working, and how the Russians are breaking through place after place. So for the US, it's really, the question is, how to extricate itself out of that. And the Trump team has, for the longest time, also still listened to these neocons. But all of the proposals that came from the neocon side, including the bone-crushing sanctions, including the sending more weapons and so on, all of that has failed. And Trump now seems to be pivoting back to his original idea of extracting the U.S. Because let's just think about this for one moment, right? What this means, the options for the United States. Come to an agreement with the Russians, a grand strategic one, including land swaps, whatever that is, and then try to force it down the throat of the Ukrainians and the Europeans. The Europeans have less in this to say, but you actually, in order for this to work the way that also Russia would want it to work, right, to have a proper solution, which of course includes a legal solution. The Russians are very legalistic. Vladimir Putin is very legalistic, and he has said so time and again. They want a proper solution. In order for that, you would need the Ukrainians to sign that agreement, and that is a tough sell. But for the Americans, what this means is that they will exert pressure the way they exerted pressure before. Remember the talking down of Zelensky at the White House, in order to get to the point where they agree to something that for them is unimaginable still at the moment. But that's what a peace or what a surrender agreement actually is, right? Japan has surrendered in the Second World War, and they framed it as suffering the insufferable, enduring the unendurable. And for the Ukrainians, it's going to be that. That's what losing a war means. So now, but the point is, if you can get to the point where the Ukrainians then sign off on this, well, then you've got a legal solution also between Russia and Ukraine. If they reject it, and if the Europeans play the spoiler, in which they keep delivering weapons and keep like patting the back of the Ukrainians, and actually support them in not giving up, what the US can do once it has signed this agreement is say like, okay, fine, this is yours now. We are going to take out all of our military support. You are not gonna get any weapons, and we forbid any weapon sales going through the Europeans to the Ukrainians. I mean, the US has the power to take away this military oxygen from this conflict, which will then hasten the military defeat of Ukraine, which then means that the Russians will get to the agreement that they were having with the Americans, even through the military progress they're making. So the question then is whether the agreement between Moscow and Washington will include some understanding that even if the Russians have to advance militarily, that they will stop at a certain point and then install their checkpoints and their border and their security parameters there, in return for the Americans to agree on to not support Ukraine anymore. And most importantly, for the Americans to agree that they will veto any idea of bringing Ukraine into NATO. That's maybe one of the largest bargaining chips the Americans have. They can offer to Russia that they will veto, that they will not only stop bringing Ukraine into NATO, but that they will veto it. Donald Trump can offer an executive order to that extent. Donald Trump can offer to try to bring it through Congress, to actually create a bill in Congress that will tie also the hands of future administrations. That is something that could be done. And here's a very important consideration, right, in international affairs, because we tend to think of these agreements as done between these big people, these leaders of the countries, a handshake, and then that's it. It's not how it works. In order for these agreements to then become implementable and have legal force within the domestic system, they need to be ratified. So you need some process of ratification. And that's the case for any kind of treaty. Whenever leaders make a treaty, that is a very big kind of memorandum of understanding. Before these memorandum of understanding haven't passed through the legal process at home. Before they didn't pass, in most democracies it's in all democracies it's parliament. Before they haven't passed through parliament, they don't become domestic law yet. So and that's actually that's the case also for the US. If this is going to be a treaty, and I'm absolutely sure the Russians are going to insist on having a treaty with the US on this, then the treaty also needs to be ratified through Congress in the US, and it needs to be ratified through the Russian parliament on their side. And once that is the case, once that's done, it becomes national law and binds also future executives. Now, if that's where they are going to, and if the treaty then includes provisions that says that the US will veto Ukraine membership, B, not allow for any kind of weapons sales, transfers, or transports from US manufacturers and so on to Ukraine, then it would even block the capacity of most of the European states to give weapons, because a lot of their weapons are actually originate from the United States. I mean, there is a lot of possibilities in which a proper agreement can exert extreme pressure on the Europeans and on the Ukrainians, and it could even circumvent them, again, in the sense that it could give Russia the permission to actually continue with its military operation, and then stop at a certain point in return for then stopping there and still living up to the treaty, to the agreement, right? There's many ways in which this can happen, because they are the superpowers. They are the ones that hold the military cards. The others have relatively little. All the others can do is delay this process. So, and it is very, very befitting that this proxy war, or this coalition war, or implementation war, whatever we want to call it, then actually ends through the main powers, or that the ending is initiated through the main powers and then it seeps down, because that's in the end the nature of the entire conflict. So the ratification process is going to be an important one. It's not a straightforward one, but it is a way in which the US can make sure together with the Russians that they get to an end of this conflict, and that the Europeans can't do anything. It's actually seeping in also in Western media. CNN just had this headline here: Trump-Putin summit in Alaska resembles a slow defeat of Ukraine. Yes, it doesn't resemble a slow defeat. It is the defeat of Ukraine, because the choice for the US is really just whether to double down and risk even more escalation and risk going to a nuclear level, or actually accept that this is not working and actually going to the nuclear level. The US has already tried everything. The US already threw basically all the conventional weapons it had into this fight. So really, the only thing that is left at this point is risk escalation into the nuclear realm. And Ukraine, for as much as the Ukrainians hate hearing that, is not an existential issue to the United States. It is not. It's just not one of the nuclear not one of the issues for which the US would use nukes and risk a nuclear exchange with Russia. It's just not. It is an existential issue for Ukraine, but Ukraine alone, or even just with the Europeans, has no cards. It can't play the military game. It cannot. It can delay the inevitable for a couple of weeks or months, but depending on the level of US withdrawal from this proxy war, it will go pretty fast. It won't be immediate, but it will go pretty fast. Just think about it. Took even in Vietnam, right? It still took a while for the North Vietnam to take over South Vietnam completely, but it was at the point where the United States took itself out of the proxy war. It was done. It was done for South Vietnam. It was just a question of time. And I must again say how disingenuous this is, that Zelensky rejects all and any kind of recognition of military realities on the ground, because actually I showed this in a previous discussion, but there's a new Gallup poll out, right, of this a statistics institute in the US of August 7th, so just last week, right? Very, very recent, which now shows that Ukrainian support for the war effort is collapsing. And it's just, if you look at this graph, I've showed it before, we are now at a point where 69% of Ukrainians say that Ukraine should seek to negotiate an ending to the war as soon as possible. And only 24% are saying that Ukraine should continue fighting until it wins the war. So in Ukraine itself, or at least the people polled by this institute, and yes, we would have to look who that includes and so on and so forth. But let's suppose at the moment that this more or less represents is a representative slice of Ukrainian of the Ukraine population. Even if there are some bias in it, this 69%, even if this is just 60 or 55, it's just a huge number of people that now say, no, look, we need to end this. This needs to. I mean, we now need to negotiate, and negotiations at this point will obviously include territorial changes. It's just saying that it's not fair and saying that it is illegal. Depending on how you structure your argument, you might make that argument, yes, and you might even turn out to be right, logically right, yes, but it's not about that. It's about what now happened as the outcome of a war. And wars are never they're never fair. They're never good. They're never, in this sense, legal. Both sides. One side will always claim that this was an illegal war, right? Necessarily. But at this point, you need to get out of the war. And so the actually Ukrainians support finding an end to this war. So this process is quite important to me at the moment, and I think under international law, there's a lot of routes, a lot of ways to go for Russia and the US, especially if they decide that they want to cooperate on the international level as well. I mean, again, if these two agree on how to end the Ukraine war and how the end should happen, they can even take it to the Security Council. They can take it to the UN. They can take it to the UN General Assembly. They can take it to the Security Council. And in the Security Council, you would have Russia, the US, and you would have China, who would certainly back whatever the Russia and the US now propose. And then the other two powers are France and the UK. And yes, both of them might try to spoil something, but we know on what kind of short leash the UK is, and the UK will ultimately agree to what the United States dictates. The only wild card is France, but with France and Macron, it's reasonable to think that they could be convinced to not vote against. They don't have to vote in favor of what the others propose, but they just don't have to vote against. You could even imagine a Security Council resolution. That's how powerful the cooperation between these two states is, if they really come to a grand agreement. And I am absolutely certain that this agreement for Vladimir Putin will include a security structure, because they've been saying that this is what they want, this is what they need. They need some sort of cooperative way forward. And make sure that this is not just a stalemate and a freeze of the front lines. Again, what the Russians have been saying time and again is that they do not just want a Minsk 3, not just a freezing of this, because the Europeans will just use this, and NATO will just use this in order to rearm and then attack again in a couple of years down the road. What they want is a agreement on a cooperative security structure. So back to the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe, the OSCE, back to multilateralism, back to arms agreements, and not all of that can go into this framework treaty, but the framework treaty that might happen in order to end the proxy war and come to a proxy peace, even if the proxy itself doesn't agree, and even if the proxy continues to fight. What can go in there is a general understanding of the process forward. And I've been saying this many times: the Russians think in processes. The Russians don't think in clear-cut, one moment handshake deals and over and done. They think in what's going to come next after this and how to push global politics into a beneficial way for Russia, right? So how to push forward in order to not just resolve Ukraine, but ameliorate the situation, the bilateral relations with the United States, and in the end transform this into a process that leads to structural security in Europe, right? And to new agreements and to a rapprochement with these former enemies, which of course then in the end will include Ukraine. But to get there, it might be needed to put even more pressure. But if the pressure then comes from both sides, if it also comes from the United States, militarily from Russia, economically and otherwise from the United States, there's really very little Ukraine, the government in Kiev can still put up. And again, I must emphasize, we're again at the point where the general population is sick and tired of this because they've suffered so much. The Ukrainians have suffered so much from this irresponsible proxy war that the Biden administration and the collective West is implementing through them, is still trying to fight to the last Ukrainian. That by now it seems to getting more clear also to the Ukrainians that fighting to the last Ukrainian is not in their interest, and that it is better to lose territory but agree to an end of this and actually include something, a future perspective for the Ukrainians, cooperation with the European Union, but also cooperation with Russia, Ukraine. And it must be said again, what is the sovereign Ukraine, the way that Ukraine is going to remain in the borders that it will have after this peace, can and should still be a bridge between the EU and Russia, and a permanent neutral Ukraine with trade relations with Russia and the EU would be a great success for Ukraine, and it could really get extremely prosperous. Ukraine could get fantastically prosperous as a bridge if it wasn't a wall, a border, or even worse here, an implementation partner for a proxy war. So, long story short, I do think we're looking now at a proxy peace, the negotiation of a proxy peace, even if the war itself continues. It seems that the Americans have accepted this. The Europeans, of course, not the Europeans, still say ceasefire needs to come first before we talk. But the Americans are saying, nah, fine, okay. We talk, we meet, we make agreements while the military operation is ongoing. And once we have the diplomatic agreements, the military operation will also come to an end. And that's so the Russians, they got their way. They got their way with this approach, with playing the long game, with having a war of attrition, as horrible as it is, as terrible as it is. But now the Americans seem to have understood that the only way of extricating themselves, either by ending the war or by then taking themselves out and just washing their hands of it, is by actually going the way with the Russians and shift gears, shift diplomatic gears. Thank you for your attention today.